One.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another event in our webinar series for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. Many of you probably already know me, but my name is Robert Kobza. I am the Vice President of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, or as we also like to be known as Goose. So this evening we have Mike Markowitz, who is going to be discussing Wargame graphic design with us. Before we get started, just want to go over a few procedural things. First, as always, we ask that everybody turn off their cameras as well as mute their microphones just to save bandwidth and not have folks talk over one another. Additionally, for the Q&A format, what we're going to do is Mike is going to go through his presentation, and then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. And when we get there, in fact, actually, as we go along in the process, in the presentation, if you have questions that come to mind, feel free to type them into the chat box, because at the end, I will read them out loud to Mike, as opposed to having everybody trying to talk over one another through over the microphone. So again, if you have any questions throughout the process, just put them right into the public chat box, and I'll be keeping track of those, and we'll ask those to Mike at the end of the presentation. So for tonight's event, again, we'll be covering Wargame graphic design. Mike is a senior research specialist at the Center for Naval Analysis in Arlington, Virginia, where he has designed components for dozens of defense wargames. He has worked in the aerospace and defense industries as a technical writer, trainer, and editor. His published game designs include ALEXANDROS and SUPERMARINA. He's lectured, and additionally, he has lectured for many years at the annual Connections Wargaming Conference. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Mike, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Robert. What is graphic design? One definition that I like is that graphic design is the use of visual images to communicate ideas. That's very different from fine art, which what an artist like Picasso does, of course, is use visual images to communicate feelings. And it's also very different from commercial illustration, which is the use of visual images to sell products. If you go to your human resources department and tell them that you need a wargame graphic designer, they're probably going to send you someone who was trained and very well trained as a commercial illustrator to use visual images to sell products. That's not quite what we need in wargaming. It's probably easier for a wargamer to learn graphic design than for a graphic illustrator to learn wargaming. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of our problem. Wargames are essentially a visual medium, whether they are delivered on the tabletop or on the computer screen. But very few wargamers are visual thinkers. In my world, which is defense and national security wargaming, most of the wargamers are staff officers or trained as defense analysts, operations researchers, in some cases political scientists, in some cases scientists and engineers, but not necessarily visual thinkers. Most graphic designers, for historical reasons, are Macintosh people, Apple users, whereas, of course, most of the environments that we operate in national security and defense are Windows environments. This is less of a problem these days than it used to be, because it's very easy to create things on a Mac and then just bring them over to a Windows environment. In military affairs, we talk a lot about the concept of a theater of operations. And when you think about that metaphor, it's a bit odd. Theater, well, a theater is a place, but theater is also an ancient art form with roots that go back centuries. And there is a sense in which wargames are like theatrical productions. Let's put on a show. You can think of the game board as the stage and the scenery. The game pieces that are manipulated by the players are the actors and the props. The game rules and the scenario are the script. Scenario, that's another loan word from the world of theater. Well, what about the players? Well, of course, the players are the audience, but they are a participant audience that determines the course of the play and the course of play. The tools that a graphic designer has to work with are shape, color, symbology, hierarchy of sizes, line weights and line styles, and typefaces, which we incorrectly call fonts in computer software. These are the tools that a graphic designer has to work with. Think about the symbol of the skull and crossbones. That is a multivalent symbol. It can mean many different things. On a container, it could mean that the contents of that container are poisonous. On a flag, it could mean that pirates have taken over your ship. I want to talk a little bit about line weights and line styles. Conventionally on maps, the way we represent a railroad is with a solid line that's crossed by little tick marks at intervals, right? Anyone who's familiar with the language, the visual language of maps, will look at that line and say, oh, that represents a railroad. Or a row of dashes with X's in the intervals, that's a conventional symbol for a barbed wire fence, right? A red octagon, think about that, right? All you have to do is see a red octagon and immediately you're thinking stop sign. The international symbol for laser hazard, right, is that starburst in a triangle. And that communicates regardless of the language that the viewer speaks, right? If you know the meaning of that symbol, it immediately tells you what it means. So these are the tools that a graphic designer works with. In the world of computer graphics, we have a whole complex menagerie of different file formats. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, do remember that JPEG and PDF are your best friends, right? Because they go seamlessly across platforms, right? They're easy to work with, they're compact, right? And under the right conditions, they're also editable. There are two great families of graphic file formats that we call bitmap or raster, which are based on an array of pixels. A pixel is one colored dot. A good computer screen is 72 or 96, possibly pixels per inch, right? And then the other family of graphic formats are vector or object-based formats. That's where PDF lives. Adobe Illustrator's native format .ai, SVG, scalable vector graphics. A lot of the maps that I create, I base on SVG. Windows Metafile is the native file format for graphics in Microsoft Office. And sadly, in many of the environments where we work, the only graphic design tool that a user may have access to is PowerPoint. And PowerPoint, unfortunately, has very limited graphic tools to work with. For many scanners, the native file format is TIFF, TIFF, which creates very large files, right? Which you usually want to downgrade into or saved as something else before you use them in your products. But becoming familiar with graphic file formats and their advantages and limitations is an important part of the toolkit for any professional graphic designer. Here's one of the tips and tricks that if you don't learn, you should perhaps know about. Screen capture is something that I use constantly every day. Anything that you can get on the screen of your computer, you can save as a graphic file and manipulate in your products. On Windows, there's a tool called Snipping Tool. It's a kind of little desk accessory. And just drag a box around something and save it as a JPEG. Or you can save the entire screen by pressing Shift Print Screen. That copies whatever is on your screen and puts it on the clipboard, and then you can paste it into some application. In the Mac world, there used to be a program called Grab. The current version is a little accessory called Screenshot, which enables you to drag a box around anything on the screen and save it as a graphic file. Or you can save the entire screen by pressing Shift Command 3. That puts it on the clipboard and you can paste it into your graphic program. Screen capture is your friend. Here's some things that I want you to remember. Primary colors, red, yellow, green, blue, the bright saturated colors, the small box of crayons, should be used sparingly and for emphasis. You've probably read or been told that writing in all capital letters is like shouting. In the world of graphics, using primary colors is like shouting. You should design your graphic products using soft, muted, pastel, earth tone colors. For one thing, they print a lot faster, right? The darker something is, the more ink it's going to use up. It's also very important to maximize readability. If your users cannot read your map, your counters, your charts and tables, all the effort you put into them is wasted. What that means is don't use tiny text. I try to avoid using text smaller than 12 point on anything. Point, there are 72 points per inch. That's how we measure the size of type, right? So 12 point type is 1/6 of an inch in height. Because the software applications give you an enormous menu of different typefaces, that doesn't mean you should use them all. I try to restrict myself to no more than 2 typefaces in a product. Usually a sans serif font like Arial or Helvetica, and a serif font like Times New Roman. Times New Roman and Arial Narrow are 2 typefaces that hold up extremely well in small sizes for legibility. And so those are my go-to typefaces. Above all, you should never assume that something is going to look good on the tabletop or on the page if it looks good on the screen of your computer. Why is that? The screen of the computer emits light from phosphors or LEDs. So even in a darkened room, you can read the screen of your computer because it is emitting light. The page or the tabletop reflect ambient light, the light in the room, from dyes or pigments, right? That's a completely different effect once it gets in the eye and is processed by the brain, right? Things that look good on the screen are often going to appear much too dark on the tabletop, especially when, like most wargame graphic designers, you have no control whatever over the lighting in the room where your players are going to utilize that product. What are the things that a wargame graphic designer creates? Well, to begin with, there's the game board or map. There are the game pieces, which we call unit counters or markers of various kinds. But also there's many other graphic products that you may need to create to support your game. Games usually come with charts and tables of various kinds. There may be in your design a requirement for playing cards that serve various purposes. We'll talk a little bit later about cards. A war game product often should come with a rule book, although your players are not going to read it, or a read-ahead briefing if your game is a one-off event, although your players are not going to read it. A good rule book or read-ahead briefing will be illustrated with examples of play, right? Especially if there are complex mechanics in your game that would benefit from a how-to-do-it chart. And of course, the identity of your game can be visually emphasized and expressed through the box cover art or through the logos that you use on the game material. And just as an example, I threw in a couple of logos that I've created for different games and events. What is a logo? A logo is a visual expression of a concept. So for example, if you saw the movie, The Fifth Element, the stones in The Fifth Element are marked with logos for fire, water, earth, and air, the four traditional elements, right? Wavy lines for fire, horizontal wavy lines for water, jagged lines for earth, straight lines for air. I found another set of icons for fire, water, earth, and air, just to illustrate this slide. Icon with a K is a holy image in an Orthodox church. Icon with a C, I-C-O-N, right, is a small visual symbol that communicates a concept or an idea. When most wargamers open up the box on a new wargame, the question that they ask is, how do I win this thing? When a wargame designer opens the box on a new product, I think the question that wargame designers are asking themselves is, how did this guy do the four representations? How did he represent time, space, forces, and effects? Time, think about that. How long is a turn? How does this thing end? Space, what are the boundaries of this battle space? And how is it divided up into zones and sectors? One of the most important design decisions that you make at the beginning of any wargame design process is the bounding of your battle space. And we'll talk about that further down the road a piece. Forces. Well, what are the pieces or the units that the players control, right? What are the actors on this stage? What are the props? And above all, effects. What happens when those forces clash with each other? What happens when they clash with the environment of the battle space, right? Space and forces and time are the nouns. Effects are the engine, what makes it go, the verbs. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of graphic design. Time. Well, air operations take place on a time scale that's typically measured in hours. And air units travel in velocities measured in hundreds of knots. What is a knot? A knot is 1 nautical mile per hour. What is a nautical mile? 1.15 miles. Naval operations typically unfold on scales, and naval units move at best at speeds measured in tens of knots. Ground operations, right, are very slow by comparison. They unfold on scales that may be measured in weeks to months, or in the case of our current wars, in years, right? And ground operations either don't move at all, or they move at fractions of a knot. And then we have things like cyber operations, which take place on timescales that are measured in nanoseconds. A nanosecond is 1/billionth of a second, and the speed of light is 528 million knots, if you need to know that number. Well, how do we represent time graphically? With a turn record track, which often is on the map or on the board, or maybe on a separate sheet off to one side. We can think of time as in a linear fashion, and there I've put the months of the year as boxes in a straight line with an arrow pointing to March. And you'll notice that I've used color to highlight the seasons, at least as the way the seasons work in temperate parts of the Northern Hemisphere: spring, summer, winter, and fall. We can also think of those as moving in a cyclical fashion around in a circle. And there I have the pointer pointing to spring. Whether you want to represent time in a linear or a cyclical fashion or in some other way, right, is a design decision. But here's the most important thing to remember. Your players should never be in doubt as to what time it is in the game. I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret, which is that most of your players are confused most of the time. This is certainly my experience in the world of defense and national security, professional wargaming, where I exist. And that's not surprising, because think about the situation. Most of the players in our games are a group of strangers who have been thrown together and tasked to perform a very complicated task, right? Often a task that's 2 or 3 levels above their actual pay grade and experience, right? We're asking captains and majors to think like 1- and 2-star generals in a lot of these war games. The task of the graphic designer is to unconfuse your players as quickly and as efficiently as possible with the visual images that you create, so that we keep them oriented in time and space. And that contributes to that buy-in, the willing suspension of disbelief that draws people into the flow of your game. Space, the final frontier. There are 5 ways to do space in a war game. The oldest, right, that goes all the way back to chess, is a square grid, right? But I'm going to show you a different way to think about square grids. A very large set of current hobby or historic or tabletop games, and many computer games as well, employ a hexagon grid, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. But we can also organize space in a node and link diagrammatic way, with pieces that move from point to point along paths. A different way of thinking about that is area or zone movement, where we simply carve up the surface of the battle space into arbitrary or historic or otherwise meaningful zones and areas. That works extremely well for abstract strategic level games, area movement, because you don't have players counting hexes to see how far they can get in the current turn. But more and more, I'm coming to think that many of the situations that we need to represent in our war games require what I call conceptual space or cognitive maps. Many of the games that we need to develop, I think, especially looking to the future, are not going to be played on geographic maps at all, but on network diagrams or organization charts or some other abstract representation of the battle space. Well, let's start with squares. Everybody knows the chessboard, right, which is an 8x8 matrix of alternating white and black or red and black squares. The pieces, right, two symmetrical sets of chessmen, right, are placed on opposite sides of that board, occupying two rows in a rigidly prescribed order that mimics the deployment of an ancient army, right? The pawns out in front are the expendable foot soldiers, and the knights and castles and bishops, the king and the queen, right, are the high value assets arrayed behind them. But there's another way of thinking about the square grid that comes from East Asia. And that's the game called Wei Qi in Chinese or Go in Japanese. That game is played on a 19x19 grid with identical black and white stones that are placed not inside the square, but on the intersections. Think about the difference there. At the beginning of a chess game, the board is fully populated, and over the course of play, it becomes depopulated. At the beginning of a Wei Qi game, the board is empty, and over the course of play, it becomes populated with stones filling the intersections. On the Wei Qi board, every space has just 4 neighbors: north, south, east, and west. On a chessboard, every space has 8 neighbors, and diagonal movement is possible, or for some pieces, mandatory. A very different way of organizing exactly the same square grid in terms of the course of play. There is an excellent book called The Protracted Game by Scott Borman, which I recommend as a really interesting approach to the metaphors that East Asian strategic thought derives from this extremely simple, subtle, and yet enormously difficult game. Why do we use hexagons? Well, as I said, on the square grid, every space has 8 neighbors. 4 only touch at the corner points. And you'll notice that if you're moving diagonally, you're going in terms of true distance 1.414 times as far, square root of 2, moving on the diagonal, right? You're covering a greater distance. So unless you've distorted the proportions of your map, right, a piece that has a movement allowance of 3 is moving unrealistically if it's moving diagonally. On a hexagon grid, every space has 6 neighbors. To completely surround a space, you only need 6 guys, not 8, right? And if units project a zone of control, as they commonly do in many of our war game rules, if you get on either flank of a hexagon on 2 opposite sides, you've got that guy surrounded with either your unit or your zone of control. Every space touches other spaces along an entire side, and movement in any direction essentially covers the same distance. The hexagon grid is something that bees invented millions of years ago as an extremely efficient way to tile a 2-dimensional surface right? The bees were doing it for storage. We're doing it for movement. One of the best hex grid games that I have ever seen, which is to say stolen ideas from, is Empire of the Sun by Mark Herman, published in 2005. In the small world of commercial or hobby wargame designers, Mark Herman is one of my heroes. And this is a game that reproduces the entire course of World War II in the Pacific on one map that extends all the way from the Indian Ocean to Hawaii. And you'll notice something odd about this map, which is that north is not at the top. The direction of north is skewed at about a 45-degree angle. And it's an unusual map projection too. I asked Mark where he got this map, and he said it was published in a magazine as a 2-page spread in 1942, and he picked it up secondhand and immediately liked it and used it in his game. It is a highly effective, at the game scale, it is a very effective way of representing an enormous area of the Indo-Pacific. As you might expect, a lot of our war games these days are strategic level war games, right, that focus on the Indo-Pacific theater of operations. And the Empire of the Sun map should be an inspiration to anybody faced with a war game design challenge in that space. The hex grid also makes sense in terms of economic geography or geoinformatics. If you look at a map of the traditional historic departments of France, they topologically approximate a hexagon grid. You might notice that over a large part of France, each department has about 6 neighbors, plus or minus 1 or 2. There's a few distortions, especially up around the national capital region and on the boundaries, right? But what we call second order administrative subdivisions, counties, districts of provinces, make for a very effective and realistic way of tiling your space. These make historic sense. Often what these are is a central market town with the cathedral of a bishop or an archbishop, and an extent that goes to like 1 day's travel by ox cart in any direction. Another way of representing spatial relationships is nodes and links. And the great example of excellence in graphic design, in my mind, is the London Metro map. Now, when you think about it, this is not a very accurate representation of the Greater London metropolitan area. The only real piece of geography, aside from the train lines, are the line of the Thames River, so that you know whether you're north or south of the river. Let's zoom in a little. The symbology is extremely simple. There are colored lines, there are tick marks that represent stations, and there are circles that represent stations that are interchanges where you can change. The typeface, right, that was developed for the London Underground is a classic of legibility in small sizes. It's a beautiful typeface. Node and link diagram, and this has shaped, right, every other mass transit map system diagram in the world, probably. It's a simple, effective symbology. And if your game is about nodes and links, notice also that all the lines on this map are constrained to horizontal, vertical, or a 45-degree angle, right? There's a few exceptions, there's some curves in there, right? But it is a greatly simplified graphic language, and it works, right? How do you learn graphic design? You learn it by apprenticeship, and you learn it by studying examples of excellence, and then trying to emulate, which is to say, steal from them. Zone movement. And here I'm using an example from one of my own game designs, Spartacus. This is published in 1991. The entire primary sources, the ancient history on the slave revolt of Spartacus, amounts to about 4 paragraphs. So the designer of a historical game has a great deal of freedom in the choices that you can make. You are not constrained by a tremendous amount of documentation. But what came through to me very clearly in the story, right, is that the historic provinces of Italy meant something, but within certain provinces, there were special locations. And if you're familiar with Italian geography, down the spine of the peninsula, there is a range of mountains, right? And the slave gladiator army, right, used the rough terrain in those mountains to great advantage. So I put a line of sort of arbitrary mountain provinces down the spine of the peninsula, but tried to remain faithful to the historic provinces. And then like Naples and Rome are walled cities, which have special effects. And then the marshes south of Rome and Mount Vesuvius, right, which had not yet erupted at this time, right, was also like a special hideout or sanctuary for the slave army. Zone movement, right? It works, and be willing to put subzones inside your zones for special effects. For me, the hardest problem in wargame graphic design is the representation of urban terrain. Why is that? Well, you know, the wargame map is a 2-dimensional surface, but the reality of war is that war is 3-dimensional. And in fact, increasingly, modern conflict is n-dimensional for large values of n. So when we try to represent the complex 3-dimensional, multi-story, built-up area geography of a city on the playing surface of our games, that's a challenge. One of the first successful attempts at that is the 1973 game Hue by the brilliant John Hill. It is a classic, but you'll notice on the Hue map, the Imperial Palace is constrained to a hexagon. But when you look at the actual map of the city, it's square. The tyranny of the hex grid, right, can lead you to make things that are ugly. That's the only way I know how to say it. One of the most intense, visually beautiful representations of a city on a wargame map is Streets of Stalingrad, published in 2003 by the very talented Dana Lombardi, a great designer, right? It is a complex game. Notice that in some cases, he constrained things like the slopes and the hillsides to the hex grid, but in other cases, he just let the actual detailed map of the city, right, dominate the visual presentation of the space. A game that I'd like to talk about at a little more length is the game Fallujah, published in 2016 in Modern War. Because when I first opened it and unfolded the map, I went, say what? The map is just a matrix of 6 avenues of approach and 11 phase lines. And at the intersection of those lines, there's a symbol. And I want to show you those symbols in a little more detail. So I scanned the image. Bear with me for a second. Here it is. This is the terrain effects chart from the game Fallujah. There's only 4 kinds of terrain: open space, urban or built up, a key objective, right, which is something that you're trying to seize.
Hey, Mike, I don't think you were showing the map of Fallujah. I think you have to-
Screen share, hang on, sorry about that. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second, and I'm going to start up again. Can you see this now?
Perfect, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. There's open terrain, there's urban terrain, there's objectives, which play an important role in the game. There's mosques, which are very important as a different category of objectives. Then there's routes of advance, phase lines, there's bridges, really simple terrain, right? But in terms of the design of the game, it works, right? I like to talk about game design as a process of proliferation of complexity followed by ruthless simplification. And in the course of the game design, you'll go through many cycles of proliferation of complexity, ruthless simplification, proliferate complexity, ruthlessly simplify. This is a game designer who had his simplification mojo down cold. I think it's a brilliant game. It's a simple game. And at the operational level, it's a really good representation of operational combat in the urban area. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to my PowerPoint. Here we go. Thank you for your patience. Finally, we come to conceptual space.
Hey, Mike, you're not sharing.
Oh, here we go again. We're back. Got it?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, this is a game that was published in 1977 in Strategy and Tactics magazine. If you can find a copy, I think it's one of James Dunnigan's most brilliant designs. Everyone hated it because it was so far ahead of its time. The plot to assassinate Hitler is played on an abstract map of occupied Europe, where Berlin occupies the center and the different Nazi party, German army, SS, and Abwehr strongholds and offices are represented on a hex grid, right? And then the peripheries are the different occupied countries. And the pieces are different Nazis who move around trying to recruit or subvert or rat out each other, right? Until the resistance side decides to launch the coup, right? Which then either succeeds or fails based on how well they've built their network. As I said, it is a complicated game. Players hated it because it was unfamiliar, right? But I thought that this was willing to think outside the box, right? And create a cognitive map of a conceptual space. As I said, one of the most important decisions that you're going to make as a game designer is how you frame your battle space. Because it's possible that the real conflict is actually happening off your map. It's often the case that the borders on the map that matter so much to us are irrelevant to our adversaries, much the way that the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is irrelevant to many of the Pashtun people. And it may well be that the critical dynamics in the conflict that you're trying to represent are not spatial in nature. Remind yourself constantly that war is about people. It's not about lines on a map. How we represent forces, right, is much of the work that a graphic designer has to do because you're making the pieces. And some of the decisions that you have to make are you going to use just flat cardboard counters or wooden blocks or plastic tiles? Are you going to represent things by symbols or by silhouettes or by more ambitious illustrations? Are you going to allow stacking of multiple units, or are you going to let your players group different pieces together and only move a task force marker on the board? I always know I'm looking at a bad design when I see enormous stacks of counters that the players are constantly knocking over. Also, in modern conflict, we're often representing all kinds of joint operations, right? So having exactly the same kind of piece, the same shape and physical form, represent an air unit, a ground unit, a surface naval unit, and a subsurface naval unit may be a mistake because you've got a lot of different shapes that you can use. And if different environments are represented by different physical forms of counters, what is that helping? It's helping to unconfuse your players. It's creating a more functional visual situation display. Unfortunately, many wargamers, like just as many analysts crowd too many words onto their PowerPoint slides, wargamers are tempted to crowd too much information onto their game pieces. I have seen game pieces that had 6 different numbers on them. No, right? If you're putting 6 or 7 or 10 different pieces of information on your counter, rethink your game design. A good rule of thumb is don't have more than 4 different numbers on a game counter. And that's a 1-inch game counter. That's a big honking thing. Half-inch game counters are generally much too small if the game is going to be played by more than 2 people. Now, if many people are going to be viewing and playing and interacting with your game, you've got to make the map big. You've got to make the pieces big so that people can see them. Now, if you make the map so big that it's impossible to reach the counters in the middle, you've probably overshot, right? We've had games where we had to use croupier sticks to move the counters because the playing surface was so large. Cards. Cards were a kind of revolution in war games and become very popular. Cards can represent events, they can represent player roles, they can represent resources, they can be keyed to locations. Cards can give you more information about your pieces than can be printed on that piece. Rule of thumb, use cardstock that's 80-pound or heavier. Or if you're printing your own cards, get the plastic sleeves called deck protectors. You can buy them at any hobby shop. And they're available in various colors. And you can then print your cards on thin stock, cut them apart, put them into sleeves, and they're easy to shuffle and to manipulate, and they won't get stained. Symbols, these are the standard, what we call NATO symbols. These are defined in Mill Standard 2525. Hundreds of pages of military specification that define symbology for every imaginable and many unimaginable types of units. So for example, infantry symbol, that's crossed rifles, the branch symbol. Cavalry symbol, that's saber, the branch. The armor or tank symbol is the oval treads of a tracked vehicle. That should not be an ellipse. It should be a rectangle rounded at both ends if it's going to be compliant with the standard. I had to make up a symbol for laser cannon for a game, so I just used the laser hazard warning symbol with an arrow coming out of it. Right. Use your imagination to create symbols for things that are not in the standard repertoire. The standard defines symbology as well that are along the top of the rectangle that indicate the size of the unit, all the way from army group down to a fire team, or even actually a sniper team of 2 men. There's a size symbol for that. It's a circle with a slash through it. So warships, I like to represent with silhouettes. A cluster of 3 symbols representing a group of similar ships. Aircraft, I use the top-down or plan form drawing. If something is low observable, I'll indicate that by putting the silhouette in gray or an outline. The exception is helicopters, because helicopters are much easier to recognize viewed from the side rather than from above. The exception being the wonderful MV-22 Osprey, which is more like an aircraft than a helicopter. So I represent that with a top-down view. Ground forces, on the other hand, well, vehicles and buildings that are seen from above are all just rectangles. And so if you're not going to use unit symbols for ground forces, vehicle silhouettes, especially if you're doing tactical level stuff, is a very good way to go and communicates information very well to your players. In fact, even they'll learn vehicle recognition if your counters are big enough. Finally, representing effects. Well, what does this have to do with graphics? Right? Your players need to see the effects, right? The reality is no effect is the most common effect of military operations. We've certainly learned that in Iraq and Afghanistan, but players don't like it. Physical destruction, if a ship is sunk or an aircraft shot down or ground unit is eliminated, it's removed from the board. Or perhaps a tank is replaced with a wreck counter that's on fire. Retreats, right? Variable distance, the enemy may or may not pursue. We have these things called disruption, suppression, and demoralization. That should be marked on the counter with a symbol of some kind. Or a unit may be pinned in place. You need a marker for that. Some designs use a system of step loss or attrition, where a single unit is represented by a group of counters, and as the unit is attrited or reinforced, you replace the one on the board with one that was kept off to the side that indicates its current strength or status. Finally, there are environmental effects. A facility can be destroyed, a resource can be depleted, rubble can be, or contamination can be created in space. All that needs to be shown to the players visually. In the game I did on the campaigns of Alexander the Great, I created a special marker when the resources in a province were depleted. The army had to move on because they had eaten up all the available grain and fodder. I like to show this one because this is, of all the graphics I've created, the one I get the most requests for. And it started with a sketch on the back of a napkin, literally. And it's a very simple chart of different orbital regimes, right? But this was used for playing an abstract space asset management game. The tool that most graphics professionals use to create professional graphics is Adobe Illustrator. Unfortunately, it's expensive and it has very complicated licensing options. Good luck trying to get an instance of it on a classified network. We gave up. There are open source or shareware alternatives to Illustrator. Illustrator is an enormously complex tool. I use maybe 10% of its capabilities. But you'll notice there at the center, that box that says maps, those are the map symbols that were created for the National Park Service. They are a monument of good graphic design. And two that I use constantly are the airport and seaport symbols, because as you might imagine, those are going to occur a lot on operational maps. If you have the opportunity to learn how to use ArcGIS, it is an investment in your future, because ArcGIS, published by ESRI, is the standard for the defense and intelligence community for mapping and geospatial data. It has a very steep learning curve, but there are good tutorials, and your organization may have a site license for it, right? I've never been able to master it because my brain doesn't think in database ways. But if your brain does think in database ways, right, this is the gold standard. Here's a few references I have found helpful. The Apple Macintosh Interface Guidelines is a treasure trove of well-founded scientific wisdom on the visual presentation of information to humans. Mill Standard 2525D will tell you more than you ever want to know about symbology. The first book I ever bought with my own money from delivering papers, right, was the West Point Atlas of American Wars, which revolutionized operational graphics, right, because it made the map the focus and the text off to one side. And the West Point Atlas of American Wars, I think, contributed enormously to creating the visual language of modern wargaming. ESRI's book on cartography is excellent if you want to understand things like maps and map projections. Zones of Control is an anthology of brilliant articles on wargaming. For the problem of representing urban combat, the article Feral Cities from Naval War College Review back in 2003 is a great starting place. The works of Edward Tufte, beginning with his book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, is my Bible. If you ever have an opportunity to take Tufte's 2 or 3 day course, it will be an investment in your future as a graphic designer. And the book by White is one of many textbooks used in college level graphic design courses to train those commercial illustrators. People ask me what my sources for maps are, and here are some of them. I'm going to move right along. Google Earth. Google Earth is great, right? But Google Earth gives you a God's eye view of the world, which may not necessarily be the right answer for what your players need to see on your game board. I'm going to jump out here for a second and switch to Google Earth to show you something. Stop sharing, screen share. You may be familiar with this piece of geography. And this gives you an example of the kind of detail that you can zoom down into, and you can go probably for most of the world, you can go way closer than this, right, in Google Earth. And remember what I told you, anything you can get on your screen, you can capture using a snipping tool or grab and you use in your graphic products. So Google Earth is a great resource. One of the things I constantly use on Google Earth is the little ruler that lets you measure the distance between 2 points in any units of measurement, miles, kilometers, nautical miles. It's a great tool. Learn Google Earth Pro. You'll be glad you did. Okay, I'm going to close that. I am going to stop sharing, go away. I'm going to share my screen again. So we're coming up to the end. If you have an opportunity if you have any interest in modern conflict and wargaming, right, a good investment may be a subscription to the magazine Modern War, which comes out 6 times a year. There's a game in every issue, right? And the standard of graphic design is very high. The standard of editing on the articles is pretty good, usually pretty good analysis, right? And for a wargaming professional, right, this is a must-have. Modern War, published by Strategy and Tactics Press. Some people have called this the Markowitz cycle. Never be afraid to throw your drafts away. Any good piece of wargame graphic design, right, is probably the 5th or 10th or 20th iteration, right? So much of what I do as a graphic design professional is the creation of scrap, right? The willingness to throw your work away and try something different. Often in communicating with your sponsors, right, you have to use what I call the optometrist approach. You've got to give them multiple examples and say, is this better or is this better? Is this better or is this better? Right? And then go back and simplify it. With that, we've reached the end of my slides, and I will be happy to entertain your questions. I filled an hour. Stop sharing.
Excellent. Well, first of all, Mike, thank you again for the presentation. So if you're ready, we can get started writing down our list of questions here.
Hit me with your best shot.
Perfect. So first question we have from earlier on in your presentation. In your opinion, is there any actual weakness to point-to-point movement?
Well, it may not be the right answer for the problem that you're trying to address. For example, right, if you're representing a situation where there is great cross-country mobility on land, point-to-point movement sounds like a wrong answer. If you're representing air warfare, right, aircraft move in 3 dimensions, right, and they move quite freely through airspace generally. So point-to-point might not be the right answer. It depends entirely on the nature of what you're trying to represent. Does that address the question?
Yes, no, I certainly think so. Excellent response. So next, can you discuss how you create hexes for your maps? Keeping in mind, thinking of this question, I guess, maybe more aimed at beginner designers in designing those hexes. Okay,
this is one of my trade secrets. I have a file. It's an Adobe Illustrator file that is a 42 by 42 inch grid of 5/8 of 20 millimeter or 25 millimeter hexes, each one of which is numbered, right? I acquired this years ago. It was created by somebody and I stole it, right? And I come back, I use it constantly. And what I'll do to scale it is I do it about an approximation by eye. I create my map, right? Then I import my hex grid on a separate layer, right? And then I scale the hex grid up or down to fit my map, right? I will create a bar on my map that is the side to side distance. So very commonly we'll do 25 nautical mile hexes. So I'll create a bar that's exactly 25 nautical miles in size. Nail that down on my map and then enlarge or reduce my hex grid until the size of the hex exactly corresponds to that scale bar. That's how I make my hex grids. There are much more elegant ways to do it, right? In ArcGIS, right, you can do it with a few clicks. And one of my colleagues even found a way to label every hex with its latitude and longitude, right? That's software magic way beyond my skill set. Next question.
Yeah, so next, and this is slightly related, how do you design off-map boxes and game aids, such as terrain effects charts, CRT, etc., and then place them on the game board?
Well, you make the game board big enough to include everything that it's got to include. The standard size for a hobby game map, by the way, is 22 by 34 inches. I'm sorry, I don't have the metric equivalents for our European friends. Metric paper sizes are a completely different world. And sadly, we still think in inches here, but 22 by 34 is sort of a standard large sheet, right? Now, if you don't need all that for your playing surface, you've got room for your charts and tables, which it's most convenient. I will often create tabular material in Excel because that's very good at managing rows and columns. I know people who actually create maps in Excel by plotting latitudes and longitudes, right, as rows and columns. That would drive me nuts, right? I could never do that. But hey, if that's the tool you've got and it works for you, knock yourself out.
So next, how have you considered representing 3D dense urban space in games?
An unsuccessful way to do it. I had to create a map for a war game once of a particular city. So I got all kinds of things like tourist postcards of that city and zoomed way in on Google Earth maps and determined how many stories each building was. And I created little isometric view drawings. Isometric, that's the representation of a 3D prismatic object on a two-dimensional surface. It's taught in mechanical drawing courses, okay? And it was a mess, right? It was a hot mess. The sponsor was happy with it. So we chalked that one up as a success, but it was ugly. And it was an incredible amount of work. So that's one way to not do it. I think probably the best answer is something like a sand table with miniatures, so that you're not trying to represent three-dimensionality in 2 dimensions, but you're very frankly, right, building a 3-dimensional world in miniature. things like the ability to use 3D printing is beginning to make that less of a pipe dream than it was a few years ago, right? So all the time and money in the world, which you never have as a graphic designer, that's probably the best of all possible worlds. Or going with a pure software solution. So, because if you create a 3D world in software, you can pan and zoom and display and undisplay different layers of information, all of which is immensely more difficult in meat space, in physical reality, right? So really, three-dimensional space is something more for the programmer than for the graphic designer as the ideal solution.
So then somewhat in contrast to this, conceptualizing 3D physical spaces, how have you conceived of representing cyberspace or space operations graphically?
Oh, with a network diagram, right? And because, and then the things that happen on that network diagram are things like intrusions, right? Or attacking a node, breaking a link. Right? A lot of that relies on metaphor. As anyone who has done professional defense cyber wargaming, right, will tell you, one of the problems is those who know do not say, and those who say do not know. All of this stuff is so heavily classified, right? And as I said, it's very difficult to get good graphic tools on a classified network, even at the secret level, right? Above secret, forget about it. So if you're getting down to, gizmos, tactics, techniques, and procedures, that's all so heavily classified in the real world that I have nothing to tell you about how to do graphic design for that. But if you're doing it abstractly, right, then it's stuff you're laying down on the network. Now, because you're not necessarily going to know that your network has been penetrated, or you're not even necessarily going to know who's doing it, right? This is the kind of game that works best in 3 rooms, where one room is the blue player, one room is the red player, and one room is the control cell, who is parceling out to the players what they know, right? Or how they're being deceived. That requires a tremendous amount of logistic overhead to play that kind of game in 3 rooms, right? Or n rooms for large values of n. But that's probably the right answer for certain kinds of cyber gaming.
So one small detail, we had one person ask if they could see your map sources, which I know you had listed on one of your slides earlier. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing your screen and going back to that to display it. So any folks that want to maybe jot down or pull up those links can do so.
What do you want to see?
The map sources. As I recall, you had a slide with some of your map sources. Yep, perfect. That's it.
Yeah, I gave this presentation to Sebastian, and he has my permission to share it with anybody who wants it.
The presentation will be hanged on our Goose Drive for those who are familiar with our procedures with our webinars.
Very good.
Perfect. Thank you, Sebastian. So moving on to the next question. Oh, what's that, Mike?
Shall I just leave that up?
Yeah. I don't see why not. So moving on to the next question. What are some of the worst graphic design violations you have seen in games before, or most common?
The very worst thing you can do is put white text on a yellow background. Never put white text on a yellow background, right? cut off your fingers before putting white text on a yellow background because it's unreadable, and it's not just unreadable, it's ugly and annoying, right? Don't put yellow text on a red background, right? Have some compassion for your players, for your readers, for the people who have to use what you create, right? When in doubt, make it bigger, make it more readable, right? And don't make it like in bright primary colors, which are like shouting, right? Those are, and don't make it too dark, right? I have seen wargame maps that were like gray on black because the designer thought that was stylish. Well, yes, it is stylish if you're furnishing a room for a bunch of goths, right? But for players who have to interact with that graphic, right, that is cruelty, right? Make it legible, make it readable.
So next, going back to kind of conceptualizing certain landscapes or domains, how would you design, or have you seen game designs based on soft power and influence operations?
I can't say that I've ever seen it done well, right? Because that's the sort of thing that's important to like national command authorities and the guys in suits and the guys with a lot of stars on their shoulders, right? Wargame designers are going to see a strong demand signal for that kind of stuff, right? But what are the mechanics? How do the verbs work, right? For many years, a lot of the war games that we did obviously were counterinsurgency focused war games that were based on our current operations. And we were trying to represent all kinds of things like key leader engagement, which is sitting down to have endless cups of tea with the mullahs, right? Or talking to the village headman, right? Okay, well, that's what we're sent out there to do. That's what the game has to represent, right? But what's the combat results table, right? How do we represent the effects? There is no easy way to represent complex human behaviors on a couple of linear sliders, right? We can create a linear slider on our chart that is popular support for the government, right? And we can create game mechanics that will move the current marker up or down on that slider. But what is that based on, right? Right? At least if we're shooting stuff at targets, right, we get an indication usually whether we hit or not. But with popular support for the government, right, which in itself is not a one-dimensional variable. It's a complex set of behaviors, right? We don't understand the mechanics that cause that to change. I will make that argument. That is a phenomenon that is poorly and incompletely understood at the level of, you might say, physics, right? Or even social science. Change my mind.
So Mike, practically speaking, could you give some recommendations on printing services for mass encounters for designers?
Oh, absolutely. For years, I've been a great believer in the Avery 5353 full page label stock, right? You can buy boxes of it. It comes in boxes of 100 sheets, right? You run that through your printer. You take your X-Acto knife and your straight edge, and you cut out your counters, and you put them on blocks. Blocks you can buy in 25 millimeter and 20 millimeter size in 8 different colors from Columbia Games, right? You can also buy 1-inch plastic tiles from any educational supply place, right? There's also all kinds of other manipulatives, right? Plastic objects that you can buy that are easily repurposed into game materials. I started out with dice and cardboard, and for years, cardboard was good enough for me. But when we saw how much players loved the wooden blocks, they're just more tactile, they've got a better feel, right? I'm never going back to cardboard. If you don't have access to a large format printer for your maps, I recommend Kinko's. FedEx Kinko's, right, can print on a variety of materials, including indestructible vinyl, which is a great material for maps. It laughs if somebody spills a drink on it. You can buy special label stock that is already pre-cut for 1-inch counters, but it is a struggle to get your software template and your printer and the label stock exactly aligned to one another. So don't go that route if you have a short deadline, because it takes a lot of trial and error and a lot of scrap before you get down the precise alignment. Redmond Simonson, who was the graphic designer for simulation, for Strategy and Tactics Man, and he helped create the graphic language of modern wargaming. I only met him once many years ago, and it was for a short time, but something he told me has stuck with me ever since. What he told me was, if 2 objects on a page are misaligned by 1/100th of an inch, the human eye will detect that. You may not be able to say why it bothers you, but it will bother you, right? So remember, the counter is a very small object, right? And very small misalignments, very small errors in cutting, right, will mess you up seriously, right? Great precision is required. I hope that's responsive.
Excellent, extremely detailed. Thank you. So what is something you always wanted to try in terms of graphic design in a game?
I'd love to solve the problem of submarine warfare in wargaming. Some of that runs into classification issues, right? But we don't do a good job representing submarines in our war games. And I wish I had better solutions for that across a wide range of tactical, operational, and strategic levels of conflict, right? Someday somebody's going to make a conceptual breakthrough on the representation of submarine operations on the tabletop in war games. But of course, the problem is that if you know where the submarine is, it's dead, right? The submarine relies on uncertainty about its location for its survival, right? How do we realistically represent that in a simple, playable way in a war game without having to go to a double blind with a controls, system? That's one of the tough problems, I think.
So for the next question, kind of a 2-part here. First, how has graphic design changed with the increased prevalence of virtual and distributed gaming? And then also, what are some new opportunities in the virtual environment?
That's an excellent question. Well, one of the things that's changed is that we have the possibility of creating graphic products that enable us to play games over something like Zoom. As luck would have it, yesterday I actually demonstrated a game to our wargaming team in a Zoom meeting because I had scanned the map and created icons for the pieces and the cards. Now, I didn't have a full implementation because I had no easy way to shuffle icons. So I had to take the cards from the game and put them off on one side and physically shuffle them, and then go retrieve the icon from the file where I created them. But it proved to me that it's doable, right? Zoom is not necessarily an ideal environment for that, right? But as the tools get better, right, the opportunities will become greater and the task will become, I hope, easier.
So at this point, it seems that we have run out of our questions here. Unless anybody, and I'll give a minute or two. Oh, perfect. This is excellent right here. So another question, what are design considerations for markers with hidden information?
Well, a marker can have two sides, right? Or if you make it a cube, right, it can have 6 sides. Of which only one is face up. I've seen that one of the first games that implemented that in a really powerful way was the game Panzer Group Guderian, which is an Eastern Front game, right? And many of the Russian units had just a question mark as their strength. And you didn't turn them over until they came in contact with a German unit, at which point you could see, is that unit strong? Is it weak, right? Or is it a dummy? Is it non-existent? So that's one way to do hidden information. It's possible to conceive, right, of a game system where you've got levels of uncertainty, like possible sub, certain sub, identified and targeted, right? That's like 3 levels of increasing information, right? I'm a great believer in the use of dummy counters. Most of our games give the players way too much information about the state, not only of the enemy forces, but of their own forces, right? The typical war game, it gives both players a God's eye view of the battle space, right? For most of military history, right? Not only did commanders not know where the enemy was, they didn't necessarily even know where their own forces were, right? For much of military history, right, guys were operating without good maps, right? Or, right, the natives had a very good cognitive map of the terrain, right? And the visitors, the away team, the imperialists, had inaccurate maps that were sending them down the wrong road. How do we capture that in a war game? Right. I tend to think a lot in terms of historical war games because that's the heritage that I come out of, right? And much of that, of course, is irrelevant in our contemporary defense and national security wargaming environment, where both sides have GPS, right? Both sides have perfect navigation, positioning, and timing information, Although if you think beyond mere geography, right, the home team probably knows a lot more about the human terrain than the away team does. And that human terrain has a most complex topography.
So next, with graphic design considerations in mind, what is the maximum amount of players you'd suggest for a game when designing?
Well, the flippant answer is whatever the sponsor tells you is going to show up. But I've seen war games that worked extremely well with 50 players, as long as everyone had something to do, right? A common way that a war game fails is by herding a bunch of people into a room and then only giving a small subset of them a meaningful task to perform, while the others stand around gawking or trying to stay out of the way or being disruptive. So just like, you know, a game should be as large as it is good. A game should have as many players as it can usefully employ. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
If not, come back to me.
So again, going back in this category of depicting different domains or conflicts, have you ever seen social or class conflict mapped out in a game?
Oh yeah, Euro games do that very well. Yeah, that's if you understand the phenomenology that you're trying to represent, right? That's more a challenge of game design than of graphic design. As a graphic designer, if you're giving me a social conflict game, right? What I'm thinking is, how do I use shape and color and line, right? And hierarchy of sizes and all those graphic tools that I talked about to communicate information to the player, right? And to make the player's task easier. Beyond that, that's a question for social science.
So your comments that you recently made about human terrain, a few questions ago, you were talking about human terrain. So on that topic, what are some clever ways that you've seen human terrain represented in a game?
For that, I would refer you to Brian Train, who does that very well. And more generally to the kind of peace gaming stuff that Rex Brynan talks about on his blog, PAX Sims. If you're not familiar with PAX Sims, you should be. I don't have any special expertise in that area.
Oh, totally understandable, and thank you for the resources. So again, I think at this point, unless anybody hits us with some last minute questions here, we'll kind of run the gambit here. So I first of all just really want to thank you for your extremely informative presentation this evening. Before we let everybody go, just want to go over a few procedural things here at the end of our presentation. So as Sebastian stated earlier, as usual, this webinar, like all of our webinars, will be recorded and provided on our YouTube channel. Additionally, you can go to our website if you want to sign up for or just look at some of our future events. I believe we have events now scheduled through the summer. So especially the folks who have regularly attended these webinars, I'm sure there will be future events you'll be interested in. And before we go, I will put the website link and the YouTube link in the chat box. Our immediate future events, looking at the next two, on March 30th, we are going to have Using War Games to Battle Uncertainty, presented by Peter Skoblik. And then on April 6th, we're going to have From Art to Science, Analytical Wargaming and Behavioral Research, presented by Andrew Reddy. So with that, Mike, if you have any final words, I will pass it off to you. And again, thank you for such an informative presentation this evening.
One question for you, Robert. What was the peak number of participants we had?
About 45 to 50, somewhere in that range, I think was what the peak was bouncing around.
I'm happy. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share what I've learned with this extremely well-informed and future influential group of wargamers. And I wish you all the best. Thank you for your kind attention.